A young perspective on hot-button issues around the world. This is The Hub.
History keeps repeating itself, and it often sends signals before it does, or so the saying goes. At a time of growing geopolitical tensions, from conflicts in the Middle East to intensifying competition between major powers, many analysts are asking whether the world is entering a new and more dangerous phase. Some have compared today's competition to a new Cold War, but historian Professor Odd Arne Westad argues that the parallels may lie even further back in history, echoing the turbulent decades before World War I, when rising powers, shifting alliances, and weakening institutions reshaped the global order and the global geopolitics. So what lessons can history offer as the international landscape grows more uncertain? How far are we from what Professor Westad calls a coming storm? Here's my conversation with him. Professor Westad, welcome back to The Hub. Good to see you face-to-face this time.
It's wonderful to be with you.
Your book is predictive, is futuristic in that you drew parallels between the pre-World War I history in 1914 and previously, and the current environment, reality that we find ourselves in, with very complex geopolitical changes in Venezuela, in Iran, and with the Trump's administration, his foreign policy making. Why exactly do you think these striking similarities, these two different periods of history?
So I think we have to try to learn from history, but we have to learn in a pretty concrete kind of way, knowing something about what has happened in the past. And I wrote this book, as I've been telling my colleagues now here in Beijing, very much in irritation with regard to the Cold War parallel that is so often drawn in the relationship between the United States and China. I don't think this is a Cold War. It doesn't fit the patterns of a Cold War. But unfortunately, we could say, it looks much more like the world in the early 20th century, with multipolarity, with an increased competition with regard to technology, with regard to trade and tariffs, and great powers that are very, very scared of each other, very frightened that some kind of conflict could lead to an all-out conflict, but seem to be unable to stop that drift towards war. That's what I worry about in today's situation.
What could be not even a worst case scenario, but a bad case scenario, the parallels between the First World War and what's happening right now? If you think about what happened in Venezuela, in Iran, the intensifying great power rivalry, the war in Eurasia between Ukraine and Russia, so on and so forth.
So one of the biggest issues, I think, in the world in the early 20th century were all of these regional conflicts that were left unresolved. And for a very long time, people were saying, about conflict in the Balkans, for instance, but also conflict between France and Germany over Alsace-Lorraine. These are regionalized conflicts. They will not spill over into a bigger global confrontation. And then they left them there long enough. I fear that we have situations today, such as the war in Ukraine, the war in Iran, the general behavior of many great powers within their regions, that could lead to similar kinds of spillover into a much bigger conflagration. So it's much better for us to think about this in terms of warnings from history, to try to resolve some of these conflicts before we get to a point where tension among great powers become so strong that it becomes much more difficult to prevent these regional, localized conflicts from spilling over to the global scene.
How do you see the current world order, the current structure, guardrails in preventing some of these crises from spilling over into a larger crisis? For example, the UN, the nuclear deterrence, the recognized nuclear powers in the world who are largely controlling the global narratives and military might.
So the United Nations, as you know, was set up after the Second World War to prevent these kinds of disasters. First World War, what happened in the interwar period, and then the Second World War from ever happening again. I believe that one of the big differences between now and the period before World War I is that we have a United Nations, but we haven't learned how to make use of it. I mean, today, a number of great powers routinely disregard the United Nations as a forum for trying to settle conflict or settle interstate rivalries of various sorts. The UN is less important, less influential today than it's been at any point since 1945 when it was formed. And this happens just at the moment when we are moving into a multipolar world order where an organization like the UN is definitely needed. Right? One of the lessons I think I try to draw from this kind of background is that we should make use of those organizations. On the nuclear set of issues, I'm very worried about where we are moving, because we have for a long time had a situation in which people believed in some kind of nuclear deterrence. And I think many leaders still do, but we are moving into territory now, a much more complex, much more complicated world with many more powers involved, that upholding some kind of believable nuclear deterrence, particularly when it comes to battlefield weapons of various sorts, is going to be much, much more difficult. And this happens at the same time as the great powers are disregarding the few arms control regimes that still exist, which I think is complete madness. I mean, is there a time when we need to think about arms control? It is now. And we're not doing that. Exactly the same kind of development that you saw in the early part of the 20th century.
What is your prediction about what would happen now?
At the moment, we are moving closer and closer, in my view, to a situation where great power war is not just possible, but becoming quite predictable in many ways. And that is what really worries me. You know, there is this old saying that if you want peace, prepare for war. In the situation we're in now, we have to think about if you want peace, prepare for peace. And that's not what the world's great powers are doing at the moment. So I think some of the initiatives, including some of the initiatives taken by China, to try to stabilize the global situation, to have more immediate contact between leaders and trying to set up some kind of understanding, not for an all-out agreement about international affairs, but for some kind of compromise on key issues, such as what happens in this region with regard to Korea, with regard to Taiwan, with regard to Southeast Asia. That's what we need at the moment. And I think it's in many ways our only hope, because if we continue to slide in the direction that things have been going now, and the US war in Iran is a very good example of this, I'm very fearful of what the future could bring. And very often we do not stop up and think, you know, things are bad now, but they could get a lot worse.
And how do you see the role of the military-industrial sector in the US and the role of Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu himself in particular, and probably the son-in-law, Jared Kushner, in galvanizing President Trump to act the way he did?
It's very hard to understand why President Trump made the decisions that he did with regard to this war. I think the relationship to Israel has something to do with it. The belief that Israel is the only staunch ally that the United States has in the Middle East, and that its security has to be protected. I also think there was a sense of opportunity, a sense that the United States, through limited military means, would be able to effect a new kind of direction in Iranian foreign policy. I don't think there was in any way a strong domestic pressure within the United States to take this kind of action. Rather, on the contrary, I think many Americans are quite skeptical with regard to it. So I think when future historians look at this and try to figure out what made President Trump take this decision, I think what they will focus on first and foremost is this sense that he acted on something he believed was possible, but then turned out to be much more difficult than he imagined.
I think in one of your books, The Coming Storm, you argued that there could be a pathway towards a sustainable and manageable competition between China and the United States as a new prototype of great power relations. Elaborate on that for us, please.
So I think there is a good chance, if the two countries take this prospect seriously, that the United States will be able to have what you could term a managed rivalry or managed competition between the two countries that would remain relatively stable for a long period of time. It's possible, with regard to trade relations, to avoid the current tensions moving in a direction that leads to all-out trade wars or tariff wars, or limitations with regard to exports that would in the end harm both countries. It is possible to think about the situation with regard to issues, regional issues connecting to this region, to Eastern Asia, where some kind of limited compromise between the United States and China could be found, such as in the issue with regard to Taiwan. So in the book, I write a great deal about the need to get some kind of stability across the Taiwan Straits. And I think we have the possibilities for doing that. But it would only happen if the United States is very clear that it would, under any circumstance, oppose Taiwan's independence. So, on this issue, the US-China relationship, I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, I think there are possibilities, there is room for compromise between the two. Compromise not on the bigger issues of how you view international affairs or how you view the meaning of life, but on these particular issues that matter. But then you have to concentrate on those issues. And that is what I'm seeing so very little of these days.
What do you see as the misperceptions of China? If you look at per capita GDP, for example, China is only some 1/5 of that of the United States, and not even close. Of course, China has been seeing the upward trend in its military capabilities in terms of AI, artificial intelligence, renewables. China has been leading the way, but overall, China is nowhere near where the United States is. What do you think are the biggest misperceptions that the Americans have against China, as you're teaching about China in Yale?
I think one of the main misperceptions on the US side is that China at the moment is a country whose main preoccupation is with its international posture and its international standing. I think China is moving in that direction, as you indicated, but I think it's a relatively slow process. I mean, one of the reasons why it's so wonderful to be back in Beijing, a city that I've known for more than 40 years, is to see the gradual progress that has taken place in China. When I first came here, this was a dirt-poor society, right, where people did not have much hope. 1979 was the first time I came. And I think those people I got to know back then would be immensely proud of what China has been able to do in the meantime, the kind of society that I see when I'm walking around in the streets of Beijing today. That's been the main focus of China's development. But the problem is, and this is what I try to talk about in the book, that even if China has focused on its domestic development and making people richer and better off than what has been the case before, there is also a rise in China's international posture and its international stature. Just like the new powers that came into being in the late 19th century, the United States itself was one of them, right? Germany was the other main power. And then, of course, at some point, some of those projections also start moving outwards. I think the United States today is too worried about instability in terms of the international system. I think the international system could be made much more stable if there was more room for compromise among great powers. But at the same time, I realize that much of that US concern, which is shared by many Americans and not just the leadership, is because of China's tremendous economic growth, right? It's not just connected to international affairs or strategic policy. It's also this fear that China at some point is going to overtake the United States. Just like Britain in 1914 was fearful that Germany or the United States would come to overtake Britain in terms of its productive capability. So I think it's important to understand those issues.
Do you think that the liberal strain of thought still hold water in a large part of the United States, where they think that China is not a so-called or a Western-defined democracy, even though the Chinese style of governance has delivered for the majority of its people? That itself is making it that harder for China to coexist with the United States as rising power versus the UK or Japan would have. Both were and have been U.S. allies.
It depends on who you ask. And I think with the current administration in the United States, the Trump administration, these issues in and by themselves play less of a role than what has been the case with the much more heavily ideologized US foreign policy, such as during the Cold War or immediately after. I do think for all countries it's difficult to realize what the differences are and how people think about being governed in a different form than what you yourself have. I think with China, what really matters to most Chinese is, of course, the enormous progress that China has made in economic terms. I think it's important to recognize that and realize that this has happened under the present Chinese government's leadership. But I think today these differences in terms of governance or governance methods probably are less important in international affairs than what they have been for quite a long time. I don't think we can go back to a Cold War kind of setting where ideology determines everything. I've called President Trump the first post-Cold War US president, and in spite of what I believe is his mistakes in terms of foreign interventions, I still stand by that. I think he thinks about international affairs in a very different, much less ideological kind of mode than what you found during the Cold War and immediately after. But as we've seen recently, that in itself is no guarantee for peace, no guarantee that things would get less conflictual. It is the content of foreign policy that matters much more than the views held by one particular policymaker.
Professor, you argued previously that the true epicenters of the Cold War was not just Moscow and Washington, but countries who were perceived to be on the periphery, who were acting as proxies for the great powers. Looking at the world today, where are the regions that you think are, or could be those countries on the periphery that are overlooked that could really ignite the next big conflict?
So I worry a great deal about what is now going to happen in the relationship between all of the great powers and the global south, the post-colonial world. I worry about this in two different directions. I mean, one is that we would get an abundance of the kinds of conflicts that we are seeing now, and the conflict over Iran is the most recent example, that would complicate the kind of relations that would be there among great powers. And this is not a Cold War scenario, where you have two great powers, superpowers as we called them back then, the United States and the Soviet Union, that could try to first find some kind of balance between them. The situation today is much more complex with regard to this. And the kind of conflicts that we would be seeing, we see now in the Middle East, we have seen in Eastern Asia, that we might be seeing in Latin America, we might be seeing elsewhere in the world. Those are conflicts that become much more difficult to resolve in a kind of multipolar setting. And I've been saying this for a long time, especially here in China, where a lot of people would be saying that they want to see a multipolar world. Well, now we are in a multipolar world. And of course, the advantage with that is that we are seeing much more clearly what the global trends actually are with regard to economic and development issues. The challenge is that the multipolar world is also a much more complex, where there is no one power or two powers that can make decisions on behalf of everyone else. So there is promise in that kind of development, particularly if we can resolve issues through the United Nations and other international organizations. But there are also difficulties because of that complexity. And I think for China, as I've been saying for a long time, the multipolar world is not necessarily an easier environment to operate in. And it takes a lot of learning from all sides, including here in China, to understand how you can try to resolve conflicts on a global scale in these new kind of multipolar situations.
We're celebrating a big anniversary this year, so we're deviating from the main topics a little bit. Allow me to talk about the major anniversary coming up, that is commemoration of the ping-pong diplomacy. They really opened the door for China-U.S. engagement, which led to the ice-breaking trip of Richard Nixon to Beijing meeting with Chairman Mao, so on and so forth, the recognition of PRC as one and only representative of China. How would you reflect on that episode? And do you see similar events, having the likelihood of happening again?
I'm glad that we are celebrating the anniversary of ping-pong diplomacy, because I think all kinds of exchanges, including sports exchanges and cultural exchanges, among countries are really important, particularly in the kind of setting that we are seeing today. And as you rightly said, the kind of sports links that gradually started to develop between the United States and China then became a kind of conduit over onto much more significant changes, positive changes in the relationship between the two countries.
Mm-hmm. And then how do you see the traction of the Chinese initiatives put forward by President Xi affect the foreign policy making of the global South, and also to part of the Western world, the four global initiatives, calling for a fairer and a more equitable world through development and through economic empowerment?
So I think many of the things that China has been saying with regard to international affairs over the last 20 years are things that the rest of the world should be taking very seriously, in the sense that they could be part of what drives us towards higher degree of interaction, higher degree of consultation. And I see that as being very, very positive. I think the initiatives that President Xi has taken with regard to trying to think about the structural elements in terms of the relationship among all the countries in the world, maybe especially among what he likes to call responsible great powers, are positive. I see a lot of opportunity for other countries to build on those kinds of initiatives. But first and foremost, of course, for China, it has to move from the general principles and over onto a foreign policy in which it builds on those principles to take concrete initiatives that makes the world more stable, more oriented towards compromise. That's what I would like to see.
And do you see some of the current directions the United States has been going since especially 2015, 2016, the right turn? With Trump coming into office, he's almost winning the 2020 election, if not for COVID, many argue. And he's winning a big time in 2024 against Kamala Harris. Again, this nationalism rising, arguably racism rising, and the sentiment of anti-globalization, anti-immigrants, emphasizing the importance of white people being the minority, although that is not the view held by everybody, but held by quite a lot of people.
So I think the United States at the moment is facing enormous challenges, both in terms of its democracy at home and in terms of its international affairs. On the former, the issue is to avoid the kind of division that you have seen growing, particularly over the past decade. At the moment, it's clear that those divisions are holding the country back. I mean, they are not contributing to a better future for the United States. And very similar in terms of international affairs. I mean, what the United States needs to do is to try to develop in the direction of what we now see as the global trends. If I'm right in saying that we are now, in effect, living in a multipolar world. And so far, I think the verdict on those past 10 years is that even though there have been many efforts at moving in that direction, the United States is still struggling with finding out exactly how to combine these principles of emphasizing its own interests more than what has been the case in the past, with an actual workable foreign policy that will lead away from conflict and confrontation with other countries and to more forms of international cooperation, not just with newer countries that the United States has to reach out to, such as in the global south, but also with some of America's long-standing allies, where it's quite clear that relations have to be redefined, but they have to be redefined in a positive sense for all sides. And that, I think, is the challenge that the United States is facing at its 250th anniversary.
So reflecting on the 250 years of American history, what do you think are the pivotal events, the milestones that proved to be turning points in defining America and made it what it is today?
So I think there are, broadly speaking, three such turning points. I mean, first one is the revolution itself, the idea that you can create a political community among people that is based on a certain understanding of these principles of independence and freedom. The second one is the Civil War, which was very much a conflict over the issue of whether the United States, as a country that was based on these kinds of principles, could survive. And the outcome of that war, I think, decided everything in terms of what was to happen later on. The third big challenge, big change, was what happened to the United States in the middle part of the 20th century. So the New Deal, which promised Americans of all classes, backgrounds, ideas, a new way forward that was more equitable, that was more built on the government actually having a responsibility for its own people. Also on the international stage, I think the mid-20th century was very crucial in the sense that the United States understood that it had to take an international leadership role much above what it had done in the past. So I think those are the three stages that you can look at in terms of the transformation of the United States. We are still within that third stage, but we might be getting to the end of it. I think the United States today is desperately in need of a new vision pointing forward for what kind of country it wants to be domestically and what kind of country it wants to be internationally. And to me, in the kind of setting that we're in today, the emphasis on stability among great powers, of finding ways of cooperating with others, even though tensions can run very high at times, that is the challenge for that fourth era of American policy abroad.
And that will do it for this edition of The Hub on CGTN. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you again next time.
The best military commander is not he who fights 100 battles and wins every one of them. The best military strategy does not lead to the desiccation of the enemy's capital city. Decoding the Art of War will help you understand why there's no art in war and how Sun Tzu stayed undefeatable using the science of war, with fun stories and insightful breakdown of famous battles. Find Decoding the Art of War wherever you listen.